President of India International Center, Honorable Sri N.N. Vora, Chief of the Defence Staff, General Bipin Rawat, ladies and gentlemen. Very good afternoon to all of you. India International Center has been continuing a series of discussions on national security under the guidance of our President, Sri N.N. Vora. At our invitation, General Bipin Rawat, Chief of Defence Staff, has kindly agreed to speak at the ISC on towards progressive defence reforms. General Rawat does not need any introduction. Nevertheless, it is my privilege to introduce him to you. Commissioned on 16th December 1978 into the 5th Battalion of 11th Gorkha Rifles, the battalion which was commanded by his father, General Bipin Rawat was appointed as India's first Chief of Defence Staff on 31st December 2019. For his distinguished service and valor displayed over a service span of over 42 years, General Rawat has been conferred with PVSM, UISM, AVSM, YSM, SM and VSM. He also served with the UN in Congo and received high commendation for his services. On behalf of India International Center, I extend a very warm welcome to General Bipin Rawat. Sri N.N. Vora, President, India International Center, also does not need any introduction. Recipient of the Padma Vibhushan, he is a distinguished former IAS officer whose service career and post-retirement engagements reflect the decades-long experience he has of working in the security management arena, which commenced in the end 1962 when he was inducted into the Intelligence Bureau and later trained under the SAS of UK. He served as Governor of J&K for a record period of over 10 years and earlier served as Home Secretary Punjab after Operation Blue Star, as Secretary Defence Production, Defence Secretary, Union Home Secretary, Principal Secretary to the Prime Minister, Member of First National Security Advisory Board, and Chairman National Task Force on Internal Security. I extend a very warm welcome to Sri N.N. Vora also. A very warm welcome to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. I now hand over the floor to our President and request him to conduct the today's proceedings. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, it's my great pleasure to welcome my old friend, General Bipin Rawat, to our midst this afternoon. As soon as he had assumed charge of the high post of Chief of Defence Staff, I had approached him to speak to us at the Centre on issues relating to higher defence management, which I thought was a title or an umbrella under which everything comes. But he agreed readily, but as it happened, COVID and various other developments, we couldn't get to meet all these 16, 17 months past. So I'm very happy that he has finally been able to come here because of a little change in the timing of his program, because of a sudden commitment he has later this evening. All our colleagues and friends and members who have not been able to come here today because of the shift in time, I believe, I'm told that most of them would be linked to this program online. Now, the subject of General Rawat's speaking to us this evening, as you all know, is progressive reforms, progressive defence reforms, moving towards progressive defence reforms. Now, why the need for discussing the subject and what is the compulsion, what is the great urgency. I would only say in one sentence that the enormous amount of expenditure involved in mobilizing effective, adequate strength militaries is very considerable and is growing. B, the security threats to our country are also growing. And therefore, it is virtually axiomatic, it is crucially important that our military is effective, always successful. And to be able to deliver a successful punch to the potential adversary or the aggressor, it is axiomatically true that, and axiomatically necessary, that the three services and all the ancillary components, elements which support a war should be a cohesive force so that the combined punch which is given knocks out the enemy adversary in one go. The second point that I have to make is that if that be so, then the military itself has come up with issues relating to jointness, of being able to work together. In peacetime, perhaps, yes, no issues. But during wartime, when you are operational, when a delay of a few seconds can cost you the battle, and maybe the war, then that coordinated functioning becomes the seminal factor in preparedness for war. The word that the military uses, jointness, collectivity, preparing together, drilling together, training together. So this is the second point I wanted to make, that this is the major issue. And General Rawat will be speaking to us on what is happening. Now, very briefly again, let me say that the earlier attempts in looking at what are the likely various problems facing our military have been few and far between. We attained independence, and our first generation of our political leaders genuinely believed that we are a peace-loving country, we are not looking at anybody's territories. Therefore, military can be there, but it need not occupy all our mind and all our energies, much less our budgets. So historically, particularly the army, with this East India Company, the British takeover post 1857, right up to 1947, the army has singularly its own traditions, its own view of life, its own view of warfare. It has grown that way. The other two services were not there or partially there, or not in the form that we see them today. Much younger services, the Navy and the Air Force. So they don't carry the baggage of history as the army does. If I belong to a regiment which is 350 years or 340 years old, then 40% of the traditions that I follow are 300 years old. It's not easy to cast them away. And in the last 75 years of our freedom, I dare say that each of the three services have grown on its own steam, on the personality of its chief, or on the lack of personality of those above them. They have largely had their way, largely had their say, and they have grown in their own manner of what each chief feels is required for his service. He fights for it and gets it. Now, next point that I have, what steps or initiatives were taken, if any, to secure cohesion amongst the three services, what General Rawat calls jointness. And I won't go too far in time, but I'll talk from the 80s onwards, when I happened to be personally in the Ministry of Defense for circumstantial reasons. After Blue Star, I was posted to Defense. And I have seen for myself and drafted those various documents which must still be there, that the Rajiv Gandhi government, especially Minister of State Arun Singh, became very sensitive to trying to fill these gaps of lack of jointness. So we did two major things, and I was directly involved in both these things, in drafting the memoranda and getting the approvals of the cabinet. One, General Rawat, was the Defence Planning Staff, Directorate General of Defence Planning Staff, and the second initiative was setting up a Joint Training Command, RTRAC, which is located in Shimla. And the third initiative, which is not much spoken of or even much known, related to a quick, rapid review of the contents, the syllabi of the professional military education in Khadakwasla, in Wellington, in the colleges of war, in National Defence College, and so on. All these three efforts, in very brief, did not succeed. A, because inherently the single service chiefs had no interest in the success. B, the political echelons were not that well clued, well versed, well oriented. And 3, the defense civil servants are all short-term lasting, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years. The reforms, as you would agree with me, once you commence on them, some get done quickly, some take medium tenure, some take long time. Where you have to change the very culture of a service, the thinking processes, the philosophies, from a single service war philosophy to a joint fighting war philosophy. It takes a whole lot of time and energy and a great deal of training. So these things didn't happen. And the Directorate General of Defence Planning Staff, withered away, is still there. Well, if they're still there...
We now have the ideas in place of that.
Yeah. Yes, the Integrated Defence Staff. In my time, we were a handful of people, and Admiral Shekhawat, who later on became Naval Chief, was the first Director General. I worked with him. We worked very hard, produced what a tri-service plan which was possible within the budget of the country at that point of time, when we were selling gold, mortgaging gold, and not able to pay salaries to our staff and to not pay for the aviation fuel to the ONGC and not pay for the warrants of our Jawans to the railways. In that context, we prepared a joint plan. And as it happens, ironically, the first service to reject it was the Navy, because Admiral Saab was the Director General. And then I would jump on quickly to 1999. When the war came, again we had, ironically and sadly, discussions amounting to seminars on the role of IAF and what should happen, not happen, what will be the consequences of crossing the line, etc. But then one good thing which happened after the war, which our boys valiantly won because they gave away their lives. It was a very high price, but we succeeded. Pakistan was thrown out. Was the Kargil Review Committee. It produced a report, and one day I would separately try to persuade General Rawat to have a look at the original report, large parts of which have been excised. And on the excise report, which contained a hell of a lot of information and many ideas and many recommendations, for the first time in Free India, we had a group of ministers, led by the then Deputy Prime Minister, who was the Home Minister, Mr. Advani, who was not a security man. I mean, his thinking was not, one way or another, greatly enthused by these matters, but he was a serious-minded person. And we had Mr. Jaswant Singh and Mr. Yashwant Sinha and Mr. K.C. Pant and others. So they spent hours and hours in discussing 4 reports which had been commissioned as a consequence of the Kargil Review Committee, one on internal security, one on defense management, one on intelligence, and one on border management. Interestingly, General Rawat, each of these reports were produced within 90 days. I happened to be chairing one of these committees, so we worked day and night. We gave the government reports, not 2 years, 3 years sitting somewhere. Then the group of ministers, I say to their credit, spent long hours in discussing with all of us and others the merits of the recommendations. A very large number of recommendations made, even today perhaps is out of memory. If somebody looks at this volume, it contains a great deal of some very valid stuff. So out of this report came the Andaman Nicobar Tri-Service Command, the Strategic Forces Command and so on. But CDS, which was a burning demand from the service, was not agreed to. And that demand continued. This is 2001. We are now in 2021. General Rawat took over on 1st January 31st December 2019. So what was the demand of the three services for reasons right, wrong, good, bad, middling? That demand was finally conceded by the present government when the Prime Minister made a statement on the 15th August, and then it became a reality. And we have here with us the first CDS who is going to speak to us. Now, quickly, I would say that I have spoken briefly about an area which belongs to General Rawat, but to connect it to other issues which are equally burning, I would say that the entire arena of internal security management is not a matter to be just put aside. We look upon General Rawat as the supreme authority to look at military affairs. The functioning of military at the end of the day is not unrelated to the ground. If the rear echelons are burning with arson, loot, insurgencies, militancies, and what have you, then where will the army go? It moves forward towards the frontiers. It has to also look back towards its rear echelons. So I would say that this is a concern on which I would not dilate excessively because of the time. On one set of insurgencies, militancies, uprisings, Naxalism, so on, we come to the early 80s and Pakistan succeeded in inducing terrorism in Punjab, demand for Khalistan, etc. This took away 10, 12 years of battle in Punjab from 84 to 92, 93. But much before it ended in Punjab, Pakistan had gained enough experience and confidence to try the same experiment in a much larger scale in Kashmir. So end of 89, beginning of January 90, Pakistan started this proxy war in Kashmir, which is still going on, 31 years, 32 years. So I'm mentioning these two parallel factors as another column of concern for the military. And one can't say that it is not their business because of the growth of terrorism and sabotage and subversion, internal security and external security have got interfused, they're interlinked. God knows today, 70, 80, 84 battalions of the Rashtriya Rifles were fighting out along the line of control in the rear echelons and the front echelons. Look at the military strength. If this is a job of the civilian authority, then we must take it over and live up to it. And this, what I've said just now, also brings up the question of the 11.5 lakhs of the Central Armed Police Forces. And if General Rawat is going to think of theatres, geographical areas, and how they're going to be managed in the event of a war, then I dare say, General Rawat, that you will have to also think of what happens if there's upsurge internally in these theatres and what is the role of the CAPF, the state police, and so on. And can you conceptually afford to say this is not my business? So I would pose this question for integration. So finally, I would say that we need a holistic view where all concerns of external security, internal security are fused. This leads me on to repeat what I've been saying for almost two decades. We need a national security policy which is known to the people of India. We need a national security doctrine flowing out of the policy. And I dare say, General Rawat, that the military doctrine will emerge from the national security doctrine. And the joint fighting war doctrine will also emerge from the military doctrine. So there has to be genesis, there has to be a philosophical foundation for what we do in the years to come. The second point I'll make, which is repetition, is that when you're on the verge of looking at large-scale changes in how the military mind works and how it operates physically, then I think the importance of military education cannot be underscored. Professional military education needs a very quick and a very good look. Number two, we have histories of war. The war we fought, 60, 48, 49, whatever it was, 62, 65, 71, 99, Op Pavan in Sri Lanka. And as far as 62 is concerned, General Rawat, I would urge you to please find time, have a quick, fresh look, which you must have done many times earlier, as I did, on the Henderson-Brooks report. Why are we sitting on it? It's 60 years have gone by. And much of it is already published in a dozen books written by foreign authors. What it contains, as far as I remember, I read it last many years ago, a series of facts and communications which show how erroneously we were working even when a war was going on. The circulars from the DGMO, DGMI reports, the Eastern Command responses, etc., all that is good fodder for the upcoming generation of military leaders to read, to eschew, to grapple with. And military histories must be published, all that there are, not allow them to be published sneakily by here and there. Have the USI publish them, have the IDSA publish them, whoever. And if they are unwilling to publish, you please authorize me, I'll publish them. One last word before I hand over to General Rawat. I have been saying this ever since I worked in the Ministry of Defense. And I dare say I worked for 8.5, 9 years, a long time. Not many of my colleagues spent so many years in a ministry which was rated to be dry, indifferent. Nobody is allowed to go in there, have a cup of tea. The guards at the gate, so on. That the tenure of defense civilians does not lend to the building up of specialization, expertise, that instinctive knowledge which comes from experience. For instance, the person who goes as defense secretary, though I served more than 3.25 years, but there are some who serve for years, some for 15 months, some for 18 months. Now they have a rule. You have a minimum tenure of 2 years. I had recommended in the Kargil Committee report that you have a pool of volunteers drawn from Army, Navy, Air Force, IPS, IAS, Foreign Service, intelligence services, bankers, management people to volunteer. You train those people. They should be in the younger age group, 25 to 35. Give them appointments in defense, in home, etc., security areas. After 2 years of functioning, pick up the better ones. Give them longer tenures, give them training. And after 5 years, take the best ones into regular service. Group of ministers heard me for several hours and debated, they agreed to it. But General Rawat, that never fructified. Today I am saying the situation has changed enormously. I am talking of the report given by me in the year 2000. It's end of 21. I think today's situation has come when you are looking across the board on this entire subcontinent. You need a large network of security administration institutions, bodies, organizations, even those to be manned by the state under arrangements with the center, intelligence-wise, or cyber crimes, or terrorist crime, bank crimes, and so on. You need trained people. You need reliable minds. It's expertise. So I would say, I'll go to the extent of saying that you need to think of setting up a National Security Administration service, and only elements of this service should be in defense, in home, and parts of MEA. All other ministries, departments have dealings here and there, because the spectrum of threat is now widening. On areas, sources which were unknown before are now sources of threat. So thank you very much for listening to me. I've taken more time than I had promised myself. May I now request General Rawat to please address us. General Rawat, please.
Shri N.N. Vora, President of the IIC, and very distinguished and eminent personalities who are seated here today in front of me, and some friends from the media as I see them in the rear seats. It is indeed an honor to be here, to be addressing you on this issue of progression in defense leadership, and all that it encompasses. Well, to begin with, I would like to first give you a very brief roundup of the geopolitical landscape that is happening around the world, although I'm sure all of you are well aware of. After the disintegration of the Soviet Union, we had a unipolar world, and that time the geopolitical thinkers who came out, whether it was Francis Fukuyama or it was Samuel Huntington, they professed their own theses, and people really started believing that this will be a unipolar world, and the US will reign over the world for years and years to come. And that this would be a good mechanism, where you would have kind of a capitalistic parliamentary democracy, and that is how nations would move. Well, this kind of a thing happened, and you found that a lot of capitalistic democracies began to take shape till about 2000. And then thereafter, after the millennium, things began to change again, and we started reverting back to old systems. And then people started wondering whether Samuel Huntington's theory or thesis is going to be correct, and when he said there will be clash of civilizations, and he mentioned about 8 civilizations and how they would clash. And somewhere down that line, the thesis, he also mentioned that the Confucius or the Cynic civilization could actually join hands with the Islamic civilizations to counter the Western civilization. Well, whether that is going to happen or not, only time will tell, but we are seeing some kind of a, jointmanship, if I may say, because I'm getting more used to that word, between the Cynic and the Islamic civilization. You can see China now making friends with Iran, and they're moving towards Turkey. They've stepped into Afghanistan, and they will step into Afghanistan in the years to come, or time to come, very shortly. And is that going to therefore lead to a clash of civilizations with the Western civilization? And now down the line you have Yuval Noah Harari coming out with his version of what is going to happen in the 21st century. So you can see there's a world in turmoil. And at one stage, people thought maybe a unipolar world is good because, then at least the America, being a democratic country, a democratic power, will ensure that there are democracy, there will be peace and happiness. But actually, you found that under the unipolar world, there were more wars that were being fought at that time. And then, of course, was the rise of China, which has happened faster than people envisaged. So we are, I think, now again heading back to a bipolar or a multipolar world. Now, is that good or bad for the international community? Only time will tell. But I think what we are certainly seeing is more aggression on the part of nations, especially the one that is trying to go into the bipolar world or making their presence felt, that is China. They are becoming more and more aggressive, and we share land borders with them. Therefore, I think it is time for us to start looking at our strategies as to how we are going to deal with the two borders, which are aggressive neighbors, adversaries, Pakistan on the western front and China on the north. So we need to, I think, also start looking at transformation for the betterment and ensuring that the national security architecture that we want to evolve is capable of dealing with the kind of threats we are seeing, threats on the borders, and very rightly, as Shri N.N. Vora pointed out, what about the internal security threats that are emerging? So we have to deal with all this, and who's going to do all this? To do all this, you need some kind of jointmanship, some kind of integration amongst all the security forces. Because I dare say, when there is a war thrust upon you, or there are security dimensions, security is now not just related to security of the borders. It is all encompassing. It is food security, health security. You've got to ensure that your economy is protected. And now there is environment and what have you. So it's a very all-encompassing term. And therefore, when nations do go into war, it is not just the militaries that go to war, the nation goes to war. So if we work on this premise that the nation goes to war, then I think all organizations of a nation must work together, at least those which are responsible for the security of the nation. And therefore, there is increasing need for ensuring not just integration within the services and the paramilitary forces and the CAPF that we have, but also within the civilian organizations that we have. There is a need to therefore integrate all this. And therefore, as we look at higher defense organization, the chief of the defense staff that has been created is only looking at integration as of now between the security agencies and the security forces. But gradually, with the creation of the DMA, the Department of Military Affairs, we are gradually also interacting with the other ministries. So I think there is a whole of government approach that is being adopted to look at these security issues. And I dare say a lot of thoughts that Mr. Vora has elucidated upon during his talk are actually beginning to take shape in the government. I don't know whether it has been, some kind of sixth sense that is prevailing within the political leadership, but a lot of these things are actually in the pipeline, and we will see these things happening in the future. Now we find that coming down straight to the kind of wars that will be fought in the future, we are seeing that the character and nature of wars are changing very fast. But we will also witness that wars may not necessarily be fought the way we were fighting our past wars, which were battles of attrition, man on man, gun on gun, aircraft on aircraft. This may not happen. Countries and nations will employ technology to their advantage to put pressure on their adversaries. And therefore, I dare say, when today we talk of national power, and we say national power encompasses 4 pillars, and that is the diplomacy, information, military and economy, I think it is time to also look at technology as being the 5th pillar of national power. Because any nation which does not now look at technology and does not imbibe technology can no longer be considered a national power, or a nation amongst the international community, which is a progressive developing nation. So I think we have to consider technology as a very important facet of warfighting. Now, why are we looking at this kind of jointness and integration? Today we find that we have Army, Navy and Air Force, the 3 services, with the Coast Guard, again with the Ministry of Defence, our central armed police forces which support the military during combat and even during peacetime. In J&K we have the BSF operating shoulder to shoulder with us, sharing similar responsibilities as the military. So the need of the hour is to now integrate the effort of the 3 services and anything that supports the war effort. And in doing so, we find that we have a Western adversary. The Western adversary will continue to create proxy war in our country. They will keep expanding the zone of proxy. Today we find it happening in J&K. They are attempting Punjab once again and trying to spread their wings into other parts of our country. So we will find that a weaker adversary like Pakistan will always keep us engaged through proxy war. And they are in fact a proxy of our northern adversary, that is China. That is the next issue that I think we have to look at. But as far as the northern adversary is concerned, since we have unsettled borders with them, and they have shown aggression on the east coast, on the South China Sea, with nations in that area, are they likely to therefore show aggression on our northern borders? Well, whether it happens in the form of direct aggression or he uses technology, we have to be prepared. And this preparation can only happen if we work together. There is now A lot of scope for looking at space-based systems, looking at how we can engage through space in a joint manner. We have to start looking at our cyber capabilities. We have to look at the AI engines, how these can support the military. So technology is becoming the need of the hour, and we need to ensure that all the three defense services understand the importance of technology. Now, why are we looking at what we are looking at the reorganization? When the CDS was created, it was the appointment for Chief of Defence Staff. I mean, he was supposed to ensure that the three services work in unison and through jointness. And in doing so, we realized that if we have to work in jointness against our Western adversary or against our Northern adversary, then we have to work in a joint manner. And therefore, we decided that can we not have theatre commands coming up? One theatre which looks after a Western adversary and other theatre that looks after a Northern adversary. Now, what is wrong with the present system? Here I would like to draw the analogy from what happened in 1971. In 1971, the armed forces, the Army, Navy and Air Force, under the central leadership, which was, of course, General Sam Manekshaw with his as a charismatic leader, could take control of the situation, and he was the chief of the army staff, but was becoming the principal advisor to the government at that time, with, of course, Admiral Nanda and Air Chief Marshal Lal in support. Well, I wouldn't like to really say, because support somehow has become a unsavory term, but what I'm saying is they were all working in an integrated manner, a joint manner, and working together. But then on the Eastern Front, you had an Eastern Theatre which was created, which was headed by General Jagjit Singh Arora, and along with he had his naval and air force counterparts working in unison with him in a very joint manner. You had, Vice Admiral Diwan, who was the Eastern Naval Commander, working with him, and you had Krishnan from the Eastern Air Command, Air Marshal Krishnan. So they had made a joint team which fought the war in the Eastern Theatre. And they achieved tremendous success because they worked and operated in a joint manner. But how were they able to achieve this jointness? This is because right from April onwards, we were preparing for the war. And finally, the war happened in December. So they had all this time to work together, work their plans together, and they were able to bring in jointness and then fight the war. And therefore, we got tremendous success in that area. Were they allocated resources at the beginning of the war? Yes, they were. The army had its resources. The Air Force was given some dedicated resources. The Air Force gave some dedicated resources to the Eastern Theatre, and so did the Navy. The Eastern Naval Command, though was tasked to be prepared for the Western Front on the Arabian Sea, but was also responsible, but the primary charter that time was the Bay of Bengal. And see that they supported the effort against East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. And what happened on the Western Front? Now, on the Western Front, you had a Western Command under General Kendeth operating from Simla, and you also had a Southern Army Command under General Bivur operating from Pune. And then you also had Admiral Kohli looking at the Western Naval Command and an Air Force component commander. They were working together. But here what happened was there were two Army component commanders, there was a Naval commander, there was an Air Force commander. Were they integrated in the same manner as was happening in the East? I mean, I leave it for all of you to decide what happened there. Because we had a Western Army commander who felt that he could get decisive victory, and there was a Southern Army commander who thought he could get decisive victory, and then the air resources were getting split between the two as to who should get better support, and the Navy said, why should we get left out? I mean, they had also got resources. They had got some patrol boats from Russia at that time. They said, why not use them innovatively, in which even the Russians didn't know that these could be used in this way, and the patrol boats were towed by the ships and finally attacked Karachi Harbour. And this is how the Navy went on with its battle. But was this as an integrated battle? We got success all right, but I don't think the battle was integrated. Each one was planning on its own. But on the Eastern Theatre, you find the battle was pretty much integrated because of the time and the planning that went in. Now what happened on the Eastern Front? On the Eastern Front, you find that by about 7th or 8th of December, the Pakistani Air Force had been completely decimated by our Air Force. I mean, there was nothing left of it, and so you could do a Tangail landing, which hastened the capture of Dhaka, and the troops were able to move in faster because you were able to land behind enemy lines through an airborne operation. So there you had air-land battle being played up there, joint Air Force and Army operating together, and then a blockade from the sea by the Navy, so that there could be no escape of anybody from East Pakistan, and that is how you got the 93,000 prisoners, which included about 11,000 civilians. That is the success that jointness can get to you. And then by about 8th, 9th of December, because, battle was being fought in Longewala and Pakistanis were getting the better of us, they were getting the better of us in the Cham sector. So the air forces from here were diverted to the Western Front. So the allocation and reallocation of resources took place even in 71, and it led to success. How did this happen? Because you were operating in a joint manner and you had worked out a mechanism of integration. So we are actually we have studied the 71 war and we are trying to see if that worked, can it work now? So now we are looking at creating a theatre command on the west with Pakistan, where we are saying that today with the army, if you look at Pakistan, you've got 4 army commands looking at Pakistan. You've got a northern command, say Udhampur, you've got a western command from Chandigarh, you've got a southwestern command from Jaipur, and a southern command still at Pune. These are the 4 commands. Now from the Air Force, you've got 2 commands or 3 commands looking after that front. You've got a Western Air Command sitting in Delhi, you've got a Southwestern Air Command sitting in Gandhinagar, and a Southern Air Command sitting at Trivandrum. These are all responsible for the Western Front, and you fight the war. And you got a Western Naval Command at Mumbai, and also a Southern Naval Command, but more responsible for training as a training command of the Navy. And then you have the East. On the East, you have Central Air Command of the Air Force at Allahabad, which can focus on both fronts. It can look at the East and look at the West. You've got an Eastern Air Command at Shillong. And from the Army, you've got a Central Command looking at the northern borders and an Eastern Command looking at northern borders. And again, Northern Command split, looking at North and West, both sides. So, you find that there are therefore 17 commands that are responsible for coordinating the operations against both our adversaries. Now, who will be a primary adversary, who will be a secondary adversary is something that the government will decide, and the armed forces under the CDS will recommend to the government what is the best way of combating these adversaries and also looking at our internal security situation. So we are now looking at therefore creating the theatre commands, one on the west with Pakistan. They will have one leader, whether from the Army, Navy or Air Force, whoever is best suited for that job. He will have his Air Force component commander who will become his advisor for air defense and offensive operations, and the naval component commander who will be advising him on naval operations. And therefore, the way we fought the operation in Bangladesh, you be prepared to fight the operation on the Western Front, while at the same time ensuring internal security with whatever Central Armed Police Forces you have to integrate them at time of war and make sure that you make the best use of them. In fact, let me tell you, there's a thought process also coming in that you can generate more forces for the army and the other people by allocating some of these army tasks to the Central Armed Police Forces. They are as good as us. They train with us. They have weapon systems which are equally as good as ours, or we are now looking at integrated purchase of systems also. So they also are as competent as the armed forces, and therefore they can also take on some defensive tasks, while the army on ground holding role is released for offensive tasks. And then we are looking at the northern neighbor, where we are saying we again create one command. Let me tell you, China has created one command today for the entire Tibet Autonomous Region and Xinjiang, and he's called the Western Theatre Commander. He is responsible for all the ground forces, all the air forces operating in that area, and this is how they conduct operations. So we are also looking at creating one force with the Navy, the Eastern Naval Command, and the Air Force component commanders operating with them. So whoever is going to head this command, whether it is Army, Navy and Air Force, the other two services will be there in advisory role to them, so that they also integrate with them and we fight a battle which is joint. And then of course, while we are saying we have our land borders to defend, we now also have the Indian Ocean which we have to defend. This is becoming increasingly important because of the kind of trade that is happening in this area and the way the navies from various militaries from various countries are trying to operate in this region. I think you've got to ensure the safety of the Indian Ocean region. So we have said, why don't we have therefore one command which is called the National Maritime Command, looking at the Indian Ocean region. And for that purpose, the Indo-Pacific, as we have now started calling it. So while we've got a Western Naval Command, a Eastern Naval Command, we want this to be integrated as one theatre under a theatre commander who are responsible for the entire Indian Ocean region as one entity. And then of course you've got island territories which are excellent islands of resistance in the Indian Ocean region. As of now, we created the SINCAN, or the Commander Andaman and Nicobar Islands. He is the first integrated commander we created after the Kargil war, and after the Kargil War Committee came out in 2003. And then along with that, we created the headquarter IDS in Delhi. Now, as of now, the SINCAN, who's looking after the island territories, the Andaman Nicobar territories, does not function under the Chief of the Naval Staff or the Navy. He reports directly to headquarter IDS and now me as CDS. So while you have an Indian Ocean region, the land territory there actually belongs to the seas and must be controlled by one component commander, which is the naval commander, whoever it is. And resources made available to him, because these are, as I said, islands of resistance. Looking at the mouths of Malacca and all the Lombok Straits, you can defend your territory better if you are well equipped and prepared to operate in an integrated manner in the entire Indian Ocean region. So we said we need to have a maritime command. And then above the airspace, the users of the airspace are becoming more and more complex day by day. It is no longer the aircraft, the fighter, the transport of the helicopters that are going to be using the airspace. There is a need to coordinate all the activities amongst the users of the airspace. Today you've got missiles, you've got rockets, you've got artillery systems which are firing at long ranges. Today an artillery round, when it lands at 48 kilometers across, the height at which it goes is 15,000 feet or 15 kilometers high. That is where the Air Force is also operating. And Air Force, and everybody is doing now, nape of the earth flying, everybody is flying low. But you've got missiles firing in the air, rockets flying in the air. Today, commanding officers have got tactical UAVs. They're using tactical UAVs. We've got other UAVs. Who's going to coordinate all this? We don't want fratricide happening in the airspace. So therefore, to prevent the fratricide from happening, you have to have an air component commander who will look after the air defense of the airspace above the land. So therefore, we said we need to look at the air defense as one theatre and as one commander, but who will control it? Either the air headquarters takes the responsibility, or the air chief, who's got multifarious other tasks. He's got offensive tasks, he's got tasks in support of ground operations, he's got tasks in support of the sea, and then also the air defense. So we said, can we therefore have a dedicated air defense commander responsible for the airspace above, operating under the Chief of the Air Staff and then under the Chiefs of Staff Committee, to see how you exercise command control. For example, today we are told that the air could be operating anywhere, because they can operate at long ranges, they have speed. So you could have an aircraft operating from Allahabad or even today from Tezpur and coming to the Western Theatre. Yes, it could be coming, but what is the route it will take? It will fly possibly in the hinterland, but then you will have rockets and missiles firing there. Can you have missiles and rockets firing simultaneously when the aircraft is coming east to west and rockets firing south to north? You could well be banging into each other, hitting into each other. Somebody has to take control and decide as to who has priority rights, whether the aircraft should be allowed to operate at that time or whether the gun should fire or the gun should fall silent. Even in the air defense, the system is followed. When you have the air defense, the Air Force takes care of the air defense. Even the Army air defense resources are today controlled by the Air Force, because the air defense is the charter of the Air Force. But today what happens is, because they know that our Army air defense knows that they have to take orders from the Air Force, so they follow the orders, the air defense orders, and whether the guns can fire or the guns have to be held tight. They know what is to be done. But the artillery does not know. The Army's artillery, the Army's missiles, the Army's other systems that are working, or the UAVs that are being launched by the commanding officers. Now everybody has a UAV, tactical UAV. They do not take orders from the Air Force. They do not even know. So somebody has to give them exercise the command and control over every user of the airspace. And who is best suited for this? Are the people who understand the airspace above them, and that is the Air Force. So that is the reason why we said we need to have an air defense command to control any user in the airspace. Now I'll tell you, other thing that comes up is, how do we split resources? We've just imported 36 Rafale, which are 2 squadrons. 1 squadron has been housed at Ambala and the 2nd squadron at Halwara. If the resources are so less, should we be splitting them? But the need of the hour is, you have now developed the capacity by splitting these resources ab initio. You have given 1 to Western Air Command and 1 squadron to Eastern Air Command, but when the time comes, you can ensure that both of them operate either along the Western Front or the Northern Front. So ab initio, before the war starts, resources are allocated. And depending on how the threat evolves, you reallocate resources. So this mindset that air resources or army resources or other resources cannot be reallocated, well, grouping and regrouping of forces before combat, during combat and after combat will always happen. And I think next issue that I wish to highlight is the armed forces have now, as I said, should be prepared to fight with technology orientation. If we are thinking that there's going to be battle of attrition and our neighbor or our adversary is going to come head on onto our defenses, coming with the tanks and infantry coming frontal attacks and doing suicidal attacks, it may not happen. In fact, we may find that the troops in the depth may get affected first. And you will not even know when the war has started, because the adversary may actually launch a cyber attack on you and cyber wars on you. Initially, you might find that your railway systems, your banking, your financial establishments getting affected. And without knowing that actually the adversary is at war with you. And gradually you find your military systems getting affected by cyber attacks and other issues. Today, the space technology can be used for ensuring continuous surveillance. You've got missiles and rockets which can be guided to destroy you at any time. So you may find that the depth objectives, which are where your logistic echelons are and where your reserves are parked, may actually be in battle first. And the people in the front line may actually be very safe. They may get affected only later. So the adversary will try and ensure that he does psychological warfare on you. He uses his social resources, he uses information warfare to try and prevent you from coming into battle in the manner in which you have decided. He will now make you fight the battle in the way he has planned to fight you. And I think that is what we need to understand and be prepared for. And as was also brought out, I would like to just comment on some of the issues that Mr. Vora had mentioned. So military history, now the policy is that we plan to declassify all histories after 25 years of the incident. That is happening, sir, unless there are specific reasons not to declassify a particular part of the history. And as you rightly said, the DOPT is looking at issue of now specialization. There are now people can take credits and undergo various courses. So if somebody wants to come to the Ministry of Defence, he can take credits, undergo courses on defence and security issues, and then get posted to the Ministry of Defence. So this is a new thing which is actually in the pipeline and being worked out. This is the Prime Minister's directions which have come in, that for every ministry we need to now have specialists, and that they're going to get credits, and based on the credits they will be considered for various ministries. I think we will see something on this very soon. So all this is happening, and if that happens, things will be, we will look in a better way. So that is what I thought. I think I will leave more to questions than me talking to you, because you can now, I'm open to questions, and let's look at how.
If you agree, General Robert, our last 2-3 engagements,
Yes, sir.
I have a set of questions which I think are referred to you.
I've
Then,
seen
of
them,
course,
I've seen them.
from amongst the audience you can take. I just mentioned quickly some of the points you touched upon
Yes,
in
sir.
your present presentation. Resistance within fellow services, especially IAF, you said you in the process of sorting it out. Especially the question of division of resources, assets and so on. That was the issue raised in the newspapers. Once you have done with the theatre commands, you have set in position the various theatres, such as they may be in number, what would be the role of the chiefs in terms of the hierarchy? To whom do the theatre commanders report? Directly to CDS, or to whom? Would you decide this after setting up the theatres, or is it make more sense to decide now? Now, when you're in the process of setting up new military structures, new arrangements, are you also looking at the need for appropriate rationalization of the functioning of service headquarters, and parallelly, correspondingly, of changes in the setup of the Ministry of Defence, of which you are now a part, fortunately? And this particularly in the backdrop of the high importance of fostering deeper and more meaningful civil-military relations, the higher defence. Can I read out the finish? Sorry.
Yes.
The national security apparatus, to which you made reference just now, the way it is evolving, the way it is being considered, would need considerable intellectual capital, and therefore the need of knowledge, research, National Defense University, what have you, and now you're talking of credits and people coming to the defense with some knowledge. CDS is the Chairman Chiefs of Staff Committee, is also the Secretary of the Department of Military Affairs. Is this not too large a role to carry in terms of burden? Yes. When you talk of CDS and Department of Military Affairs and progressive reform of the higher defense management echelons, are you specifically, particularly thinking of how we go about orienting, reorienting, sensitizing parliamentarians, political leaders, so that in the new setup, which as you mentioned just now, it takes seconds to attack and maybe you won't know you attacked, that kind of sensitivity amongst the higher decision makers. Then the key objectives of what is presently going on, what are the 1 or 2, 3 major priorities, especially in devolving the war fighting machinery from South Block Armed Service Headquarters, co-locating geographically proximate assets, fostering jointness. How are we doing it? Who is doing it? Has the process begun? The existing number of 17 plus 2, 19 commands, has it roughly been decided to reduce them to 4 or 5 watts? You mentioned just now this very wonderful experiment of, since the Kargil Review Committee report and the group of ministers, the Andaman and Nicobar Command has over the last 20 years, General Rawat, been commanded by general rank officers of all the 3 services. And I dare say you would know better, and inside store, I would say been commanded well. Even during tsunami, it was an army officer. So, are you thinking of now starting with a time-bound program of shifting other important crucial commands to joint commands in the progress of jointness? Is the training and indoctrination of middle and senior level officers, has it commenced? If not, what is your time frame? The Air Force and the Navy, the Air Command and the Naval Command and the Maritime Command, as you just mentioned, you have given reasons why what is being done or what is being thought about. The counter view was that if they become too large, too unwieldy, they will be inoperable. So this is very summarily of the many, many issues raised. I thought you'd like to comment on some of them.
Yes, I will begin with the role of the theatre commanders and the chiefs. Well, all over the world, the chiefs have always been staff officers. In fact, they are called Chief of Army Staff, Chief of Air Staff, Chief of Naval Staff, Chief of Defence Staff. And the commanders on the field, who actually are war fighters, are called CNCs. They are commanders in chiefs. Even if you look at any other country system, it is whether it is the PACOM commander who looks at the Pacific Ocean region, he gets resourced by his chief or the CDS there, or Chairman Joint Chief of Staff from New York and from Washington, and he gets support from there. He's provided all the support, so it is kind of raise, train, sustain functions that the chiefs perform. So in the long run, what we are looking at, theatre commanders will become operational commanders, reporting to the Chairman Chiefs of Staff Committee. Now, this is where the chiefs play a dual role. While the chiefs will be responsible for raise, train, sustain functions of its service, which means they will ensure that the training goes on properly. The theatre commanders are not bothered with training. They look after the training aspects. They look after the wherewithal that the theatres required for fighting the war, and they will continue sustaining them with the war effort when the war is being fought. but the wars will precisely be fought by the theatre commanders on an approved plan made by the Chiefs of Staff Committee. Now, this is where the chiefs are also members of the Chiefs of Staff Committee along with the CDS. So, the CDS or the Chiefs of Staff Committee will approve the plans of the theatre commanders, and thereafter the delegation of power will be with the theatre commanders to fight the war, who will be an integrated force comprising the Army, Navy, Air Force and the CAPF and Coast Guard functioning with them. So that is how the wars will be fought, and chiefs will then get relegated to raise state, sustain functions, except in the Chief of Staff Committee when the initial plans or the advice to the political hierarchy is to be made as to what should we do, in what way the battles are to be fought, and whether to go to war or not to go to war. So that is the function that will remain. So they will be dual tasked, as is happening today with the CDS.
Excuse me, General Rawat, when an operation is on, a war is on, and I am a theatre commander.
Yes, sir.
I have a problem or I have an issue, and I want some advice or some clearance.
Yes, sir.
I then approach the Chiefs of Staff Committee?
Absolutely, sir. You will approach through the headquarter IDS. Under the CDS, you have an headquarter IDS which has been created as early as 2003. This was what was created in 2003. In fact, the CDS has taken over the role and has now become the head of the IDS which existed in 2003. Earlier, you had a CISC, a CNC rank officer, but a staff officer who was advising the Chief of Staff Committee and the Chairman Chief of Staff. The Chairman Chief of Staff was a rotational entity who, depending on his seniority, could become the head of the Chief of Staff Committee 4, 5, 6, 7 months, depending on how much residual service was left with him, and the senior most person became. Now we've got a CDS who's a permanent Chairman Chief of Staff, with the help of the 3 service chiefs, is responsible for providing singular advice to the government, providing alternates to the political hierarchy in addition to what the chiefs provide. So you have kind of advice being provided to the government through a consensus mechanism with the 3 chiefs. That is what we are looking at. So I'll then come down to, how are we making sure that there is joint mess. I did elucidate and I did elaborate on this, that not only are we looking at civil-military liaison between the ministry, which has happened because of DMA has come in. As a DMA, Secretary DMA, I have bureaucrats working with me. I have joint secretaries from the Ministry of Defence who have been transferred to me. I have director level officers, under secretaries who have been transferred to me. So we have, in the DMA, we have 28 director level officers, out of which 12 are from the civilian stream and 14 from the military. I have 5 joint secretaries, out of which 2 are from the civilian street and from the civil services, and 3 from the military. And I have 1 additional secretary as of now who's from the military, could be a civilian later on, from the civil services. And of course, the Secretary DMA, who's also now the CDS. Now, as of now, as was brought out, today you have the CDS, who's also the permanent Chairman Chief of Staff, and the Secretary DMA. Is it too much to handle? I would say, to begin with, it is appearing to be too much to handle, but that is the only way this process would have moved. Because if you had somebody looking after the Secretary DMA, a service officer, he could be at cross purpose with the CDS, because CDS actually would then become like the service chiefs reporting to the Secretary DMA. So now what we have said is, as of now, it is better to let the CDS be 3-hatted, but as the time comes in and the CDS and the theatres get raised and the operational responsibility comes to the CDS, maybe we'll have to have a different look at the Secretary of DMA. Who will then become the Secretary DMA will have to be relooked, because we are looking now at reorganizing the headquarter IDS to make sure that it can now take on the function as a war-fighting organization capable of integrating the 3 services even at the service headquarters. That is what we are looking at, sir. So now, talking about the parliamentarians being briefed, yes sir, we are briefing the parliamentarians. In fact, large number of parliamentary committees are now being taken to the forward areas, where we are explaining to them the ground situation, and we do brief them from time to time. As Secretary DMA, sir, now for every parliamentary meeting, I have to go and represent as Secretary. Earlier, the Defence Secretary would go. So there are questions that are asked to me which are military and non-military, sir, and one has to respond to them. So therefore, one is briefing parliamentarians regularly, and we are also taking them to, as I said, border areas. In fact, very recently, the PSC had visited Srinagar. We took them to Dras, Kargil, and we took them to Leh. Then the committee from the Foreign Affairs had gone to Srinagar. There is the Home Ministry committee which also went to Leh. There is a committee which is now moving toward the eastern states. So all that is happening, sir, and we are trying to make sure that they get educated as much. And as far as civil military liaison is concerned, as we said, we are now working a lot with the other ministries. For example, we are now working very closely with the transport ministry, the railways, and we are also looking at integrated joint logistic structures being created with the civilians, so that we can have dual use structures being created, facilities being created. Large number of our airfields are being now made civil military airfields. We've in fact opened up large number of military airfields for civilian use. We are looking at having common systems, like for example with the railways we are working to see how we can make wagons which can also transport tanks during war, otherwise, so that we do not have to have specific wagons which carry only tanks. They can carry trucks in peacetime, and they can carry the tanks in civilian agencies. Then for the logistic structure, we have now, the government has created an integrated logistic structure, of which the military was not a part. We have now requested them that we must have a military member there, which they have agreed. The Director General of Operational Logistics is now a member there. So anything that is happening on the logistics field, we are making sure that we try and see if we can put them to better use through outsourcing. And similarly, for all the equipment that we are buying, we are now trying to ensure that we have common specifications. Earlier, we had equipment with military specifications, which the civilians could not purchase, and you could not purchase outright from the market because these had military specs. We are now trying to go for common specs. I mean, you'll be surprised that we had tires which were being used by the military, which were 24 ply, where the civilians used 22 ply. The difference is 1 inch of additional ground space that you get. But then you had tires which were being specially manufactured for the military. So we said, why can't we have similar specs? We had batteries which had different frequency levels, but being used in the same vehicle. We had military specs, and I'm glad we've got General Sareen here, who's been the ordnance, and he was one of the people who tried to propagate this thing, that why don't we go in for common specifications? And that is all happening, sir. I would like to say that training is being given impetus. We are looking at joint training between the services. We train jointly in the NDA, but that's at very rudimentary level. Then we started doing staff college. And the staff college also, while we were Army, Navy, Air Force, were training together, but again you were operating in silos. Now we have made sure that large amount of classes are common with common syllabi. You have common syllabi going on, so almost 50 to 60% of the curriculum is now common understanding of each other. We are trying to go in for a joint higher command, sir. We've got separate Army, Navy, Air Force higher command. We are going in for a joint higher command. NDC, of course, is joint. We have started a joint capsule for middle level officers, which we do in Delhi now, where the Army, Navy, Air Force, in fact, one got over just last week, where officers from the three services come in and try to understand each other. This is how we are trying to bring about jointness. And so we are also looking at logistic support, joint logistics. We have created joint logistics nodes on a trial basis at Chennai, looking after Andaman Nicobar, at Mumbai. At Mumbai now the logistics is being provided by the Navy, being the largest service. Army and Air Force do not run their logistics. The entire support is provided by the Navy. And similarly, we've got one in Guwahati, where the Army and Air Force work together. It's become a joint logistic node. Now, what does it involve? That means all your repair echelons work together, everything work together, your procurement processes work together. So the Navy is responsible for making sure that whatever the requirements of the Army and the Air Force in Mumbai are met by them. They have been budgeted for it. And this is the way gradually we will have in all the stations where you have two or more services. And our ultimate aim is to come with a joint logistics command as well. That is the ultimate aim, which we are looking at subsequently. Training command, we have different training commands. We will make sure that finally we have one training command looking after the training issues of the three services, which is happening, sir. You'll be happy to note, sir, that the cyber command is a joint command. We are working together. Space command, not a command, it's an agency. We wanted a command, but government said you start with an agency, so that's the way forward. We have started. It's a joint agency, Army, Navy, Air Force working together, headed by a naval two-star as of now. We've got a space command, which again has Army, Navy, Air Force people, headed by an Air Force commander. And we've got an Armed Forces Special Operations Command, where we are trying to make sure that the Special Operation Forces of these three services work together, which presently is being headed by a two-star of the Army, sir. So all these things are in the pipeline. And now coming about the education, yes. It is very important that we look at security education and technical education. In fact, you'll be happy to know, sir, that the ministry has only last week constituted a committee to look at the technical education of the armed forces officers. That anybody who's joining the armed forces, how does he imbibe technology? So a committee has been formed to look at the revision of the syllabi for all our people, all our courses, where we now incorporate technical education as part of this, sir. We have now associated ourselves with a number of universities where we can also train our people. We are working with RRU in Gujarat. We've got a forensic sciences laboratory university which has come up. We are working with them. We are working with JNU. We are working with very recently we are about to start some program with the Amity University on science and technology. So things are moving forward, sir. As of now, we are looking at working with these universities, but gradually our aim is also to see that we have our own defense university, which will help in bringing about integration with the civilians. Because in this university, you will have not only military people, but you will have civilian bureaucrats also coming to get educated there from any ministry. And as I said, the government is looking at people getting credit. So anybody who gets trained at the Indian National Defense University will gain credits for joining the Ministry of Defense at some time, should they want to come in, sir. So all that is, I think, is work in progress. So whatever I think has been your thought is actually translating into, I would say, to fruition in the years to come.
One small point. When the CDS has in his workaday a certain issue or a certain problem to resolve, does he knock at the door of the Raksha Mantri, or where does he go?
Everywhere, sir.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
On occasion, that everywhere may be a little difficult, no?
No, sir. I do knock at the door of the Raksha Mantri, sir. But then I am also given the opportunity to brief the PM and the PMO from time to time, sir.
Yeah, that of course, because of single point military advice and all that,
Yes.
inherent. And what is the revised new role of the Defence Secretary?
So Defense Secretary and the DMA, we have charted our course together. What has happened, sir, most of the military aspects actually have come to the DMA, and the other issues like the capital procurement is
It
with
said
him.
in the notification that Defence Secretary shall be advisor to RM on such and such thing.
Yes.
What is that such and such thing? I didn't
So
understand.
it's been very clearly spelled out in writing, sir. So what's happened, sir, like as of now, some of the military issues, I would say, other than the civilian issues that are there in the Ministry of Defence, which are still with him, are, for example, the border roads are with the Defence Secretary. The Coast Guard actually is still with the Defence Secretary. It is not yet with the...
Acquisition?
So acquisition is to be prioritized by the DMA, and the acquisition wing under the Defence Secretary will do the acquisition for capital cases. The revenue cases are dealt with by DMA, sir.
I don't know, my experience was that capital has more urgency, more importance.
Yes.
It could be also in the DMA.
But DMA is giving the priority, sir. We are making sure that the Army, Navy and Air Force, earlier what was happening, sir, whoever was able to push his case faster, as you said, dependent on the charisma of the chief, I mean, they could get their way through. But now it is the DMA and the CDS who oversees all that. And unless it is not approved, unless it is approved by the DMA and the CDS, it doesn't move forward, sir.
If you kindly permit, can I request some
Yes, sir.
questions?
Yes, sir.
Anybody wishing to ask any question? Yes, please.
Good evening, General. Good evening, Mr. Vora. You gave a brilliant speech. This idea of jointness and shadow command is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. But we Air Force guys have a small apprehension. Our combat strength is very much less now, over 10 squadrons. Don't you think, in your opinion, it should be brought up to make this theatre command successful?
Yes, sir. I think, today when we look at the Air Force, as I said, sir, aircraft is only one of your entities. I think we should also look at what we are getting for the Air Force. S-400, five squadrons. It must compensate for some of the aircraft in the air. You've just got the MR systems inducted only last week.
For close support,
Yes, sir.
you require numerical strength. For close support role, you require a bit of numerical strength with the twin threat. So that's what I feel.
So, you have to also look at one thing, that look at the kind of aircraft and other systems that we have. We've now got missiles. We are looking at creating a rocket force, because let me also tell you, the more the aircraft you keep in the air, the more you'll also be on the ground, because look at the air defense systems that are coming up, sir. So we've got that fear also. So we are also looking at missile strength coming up along with the Air Force. But as far the Air Force is concerned, so aircraft are multi-role. Today, what you could fly, 3 sorties a day with your MiGs. Today, you are flying 5 to 6 sorties with Rafales and Sukhois. So actually, don't look at it that way. Look at what is the combat power that you can generate with your people. I think you need more pilots, which we have. And also look at your superior training. Sir, with the northern adversary, also look at the tremendous advantage of terrain that we have, sir. We've got, and the kind of systems we are now evolving. Yes. Not only Tejas, sir. We're looking at the AMCA coming in the future. We want it to be progress fast so that you have the 5th or the 6th generation aircraft in the next 10 years along with the Tejas and the advanced version of the Tejas which is coming in, sir. And we're going to all develop it in country, sir.
Your analogy of the 71 ward in Eastern Theatre, absolutely correct. I was in that sector.
Sir.
And the jointness was absolutely evident.
Thank you,
Three
sir.
services really combined to get such a victory.
Thank you, sir.
Western theatre was slightly, as you said rightly. That has to be rectified.
Maybe Kargil even, look at Kargil even differently, sir. That could also have been rectified. Sir, I think, of course.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, only thing, I am also a little short of time because I've got an engagement
Okay,
now, so
sir.
I'll be rushing through the questions and the answers.
Yes, sir.
Maybe we can take 3-4 questions, I'll answer them together.
Sir, question is that as you saw, you talked of 62, there was intense reluctance of using Air Force. Now, I don't know whether you probably like to throw light on it or not. When it came to Kargil, there was reluctance to use. Look at Kargil happened in, it took 3.5 to 4 weeks to bring in Air Force. I was in that conference in Subrata Park when the Hindustan Time chap had to ask the chief, sir, do you want the enemy to come? Because chief said, we don't want to escalate war. That was his words. Now tell me, sir, has the thinking changed? Or will the thinking change when the theatre command comes? Because as we were being just now pointed out, there will be intense shortage of fighter aircraft, and you cannot replace fighter with the missiles. So you will require ground attack fighters and offensive fighters, sir. This aspect, thank you, sir.
I'll take on more questions, I think. Yes.
Military imperative has to do a lot with the regional powers. That's the balance of regional powers. And seeing the present development in our neighborhood and the recent past, and we have the states which can show hegemony, or they can unbalance the regional parts. So these reforms which now are taking place, how are we matching these?
Yeah, I think I'll
Yes,
take one to the media.
there.
I'll take-
Lady there.
I've got to.
You talked about the Western and the Northern adversary coming together. We are seeing how they have come together in Afghanistan and how they are dictating terms there. The new government is supported by them. Do you think after this experience, the gaining success there, they would be more aggressive on our borders?
I think some lady you said, sir? Yes, sir.
The lady there, yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Up.
I have 3 questions. My name is Sandhya Ghosh. First of all, thank you so very much. I want to know how drones can be used for military as well as civilian purposes. Number 2 is that I have heard recently that in the Barmer sector in Rajasthan, the flyovers are being used for as runways for the aircrafts in the Rajasthan side. And number 3, what was the fate of 7th Fleet during 1971 war? It really came or disappeared, or what was the purpose of it?
I think I'll
One last, Borkar sir.
In the new scenario which you have painted, General, very well, who will be looking after the psychological warfare? The psychological warfare. Thank you.
Yes.
Sir, Indian armed forces, they have decided to export the artilleries and other technology. Will it not affect us in the long run? Because enemies may get it and they can use it against us. Why is it necessary to export the technology?
Okay, I'll take on the question. Firstly, sir, I think question regarding the Air Force, sir, I think the Air Force is more than willing to go. It's difficult now to hold them back, actually. And let me tell you that we've got a very capable Air Force, and every Air Force commander, I mean, we are a very superior Air Force. We've got now good aircraft, and while I do agree with you that maybe the resources are dwindling, but that effort is being made to ensure that we are able to catch up with our numbers. You've seen the Air Chief has already given orders for 83 more LCA Mark II, and the other aircraft coming in. Proposal for AMCA is moving very fast. So why we didn't use in earlier wars, I think we'll keep quiet on that, because I wouldn't say keep quiet. There were reasons why the people at that time didn't go, but today, but today I think the people are more than willing to go, sir. You know, talking about the joint front, we are talking about whether there's a joint front, two-front war or something. This is something which has been said earlier, and I think we have to be prepared for that. How we'll do that, what is going to happen in Afghanistan, only time will tell. Let us wait and watch whether everything is moving the way people thought they will move. Nobody ever thought the Taliban will take over the country so fast. What is going to happen in the future? You don't know what is happening, what is likely to happen in the future. There could be still more turmoil and more changes which cannot as of now be anticipated. As far as drones are concerned, ma'am, yes, we are looking at drones, we are looking at counter drones. We are looking at creating highways into runways. That is happening. So we are trying to see in whatever way we can use civilian infrastructure for military use, it will happen. And psychology, sir, as of now, psychology is more to do with motivation. And as of now, it remains the charter of the 3 services. But psychological warfare as such is being looked after by headquarter IDS.
General, just one question to you from all of us.
Yeah, sorry. As far as the export of weapons are concerned, I don't think we should get too concerned about it. We should be prepared to export the weapons. It is how you utilize that weapon what matters. You know, it is employment of a weapon. Then why is it? You should understand one thing. Why is that country exporting? You know, today one of the best exporters and the largest exporter of weapon in your region is Pakistan. Pakistan ordnance factories are making excellent weapons, exporting it. So exporting you must do, but you keep the high-end technology with you. You don't export your best system.
General, thank you for the erudite speech today, and I'm glad that Mr. Vora is also with you. See, you have been looking, and you mentioned the fact that you were looking into an integration of the civil police services with your services for looking after local insurgency. Kashmir, Punjab have been a part of this. The Northeast is now building up. The Northeast, I mean, the little studies that we do in our little systems, we find that they are also now coming into the northern areas in a big way. What steps are you taking to regulate the Northeast? Because that is open to the Myanmar side, that's open to the Bangladesh side, that's open to the Thai side. Are we all taking steps for the purpose of integrating those areas in a big way? Because they are basically difficult people to handle.
So the Kashmir model is also being adopted in the Northeast. In fact, not much is known about it because the insurgencies have started dying down in that area. But I think it is very much integrated. The Assam Rifles, the BSF, the CRPF, we all work together, except for the Naxal operations, which are being contested by the CAPF. All operations are working integrated. We also have a unified structure in Assam to look after the northeastern states. So I'm a little short of time. I've got the appointment with the president today, sir. So, gentlemen, I don't mind coming again back here to talk to you, sir.
General Rawat had mentioned to me when he arrived that he has a slightly unforeseen, very important engagement in a few minutes, and he has to go. Otherwise, he had agreed with me to stay on for another half an hour, 45 minutes to answer questions. Some of them were online, but he did not entertain. So I'll just close by thanking you, General Rawat, very much, and hope that you would not have too much hesitation coming again.